The day my son called me after 4 years of silence, I didn't feel joy. I felt fear. Because the ones who abandon you don't come back to apologize. They come back when they need something. It was Easter weekend. The smell of sweet bread filled my small kitchen, the same kitchen where I held him as a baby, where I taught him to walk, where I made him breakfast 1,000 mornings without him ever having to ask. And there I was, alone, my cracked hands resting flat on the table, staring at the phone as it lit up. Rodrigo. 4 letters, the name I chose for him, the name I picked on a rainy night, dictionary open across my belly, searching for something that meant strength. How ironic. I didn't answer right away. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. And on the 4th ring, something inside me said, it's time. Not to forgive, to finish. My name is Elena Vargas. I'm 67 years old, though my body sometimes feels like it's 90. I live in the same house I always have, a small house on the edge of town with cream-colored walls that needed repainting years ago, a garden that was once beautiful, and a rocking chair on the porch where I sit every evening and watch the sun go down without asking anyone's permission. The neighbors know me as Miss Elena, the kind woman, the one who always has coffee, the one who never complains. What they don't know is that underneath all that kindness, there's a woman who learned very early that the world doesn't reward the ones who scream. It rewards the ones who wait. And I had waited a long time. Too long. I became a widow at 44. My husband, Manuel, died of a heart attack on an ordinary Tuesday. Shoes on, coffee unfinished. That's how fast life goes. That's how alone I was left. Rodrigo was 19 when his father died, and instead of drawing closer, he pulled away, as if grief were contagious, as if looking me in the eyes reminded him of something he didn't want to carry. I understood it then. What I didn't understand was that the distance was never going to end. Because Rodrigo didn't pull away because of grief. He pulled away because he found someone who told him what I never had. Your mother is a burden. Her name was Valeria. And from the day she walked into his life, I stopped existing in his. But that came later. First, let me tell you who I was before everything broke. Before I was the abandoned one, I was the one who gave everything. I worked 31 years in a textile factory, overnight shifts 3 days a week. The other days I cleaned other people's houses, ironed the shirts of men who never learned my last name, who paid me in cash and sent me off with a smile that never reached their eyes. Every dollar had a destination. Rodrigo's education. College, books, the apartment when he left the city, the extra money I sent for whatever you need, money he never once asked where it came from. I never told him that some months I didn't eat well so he wouldn't go without. Mothers keep those secrets like they're something to be ashamed of. There was something people didn't notice about Elena right away. Her hands. Large hands for a small woman. Hands with thin scars across the fingers, from the industrial sewing machines, from the years in the factory. Hands that told her story better than any words ever could. And on her left ring finger, she still wore Manuel's ring. Not out of sentimentality. She wore it to remind herself that she had loved well, that she had built something real, that even though everything had fallen apart, she had been genuine. Nobody could take that from her. Not yet.
The first time Valeria deliberately ignored me, I told myself it was a misunderstanding. It was Rodrigo's birthday, 42 years old. I showed up with a homemade cake, the same one as always, walnut and caramel, the one he'd been asking for since he was a little boy, and a handwritten card. Valeria opened the door. She looked me up and down, and without a single word, turned around and walked back inside, leaving me standing in the doorway, cake in my hands, card in my pocket. I waited 3 minutes at the door before Rodrigo appeared. 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours. The neighbors across the street saw me, an older woman standing alone at the entrance of her own son's house, like an uninvited guest, like a stranger. Rodrigo hugged me briefly, one of those hugs that lasts exactly long enough to fulfill the obligation and nothing more. "Mom, you didn't say you were coming." I didn't say, because I never used to have to say, because that used to be my house too, because he used to be his first call on his birthday, because he used to look for me. But I didn't say any of that. I smiled. I walked in, and I noticed immediately that something had changed. The house smelled like expensive perfume and disinfectant. Everything was in its perfect place. Throw pillows arranged with ruler-straight precision, artificial flowers in glass vases, a kitchen that looked like a magazine spread but had clearly never been used to actually cook anything real. Nothing of mine was there. Not a single photo. Not the embroidered picture I gave him when he moved in. Not the wooden clock that had belonged to his father. Nothing. As if I had never existed in his story. I sat down in the living room. Valeria walked in with a glass of wine and settled in next to Rodrigo like I wasn't there. They started talking to each other. Vacation plans, a trip to Europe, a dinner with the important friends on Friday. I listened. At some point, I tried to join the conversation. "Rodrigo, remember when you were little and you always said you wanted to see Italy? You used to say you were going to take me to the Colosseum someday." Valeria let out a short laugh. Not a warm laugh, a dismissive one. "How cute," she said, in a tone that meant exactly the opposite. Rodrigo said nothing. He didn't defend me. He didn't turn to look at me. He just picked up his glass and changed the subject. The walnut and caramel cake ended up on the kitchen counter, untouched, uncut, unacknowledged. When I left, after an hour that felt like a punishment, I watched in my rearview mirror as Valeria closed the front door before I even reached the corner. I drove 15 minutes in silence. Then I pulled over, and I cried. Not from sadness, from humiliation. Because there's a difference. Sadness hurts on the inside. Humiliation hurts in front of everyone. But that was only the beginning. Over time, the visits grew further apart. First every month, then every 3, then only on mandatory occasions. Christmas, Mother's Day, and always with some excuse to keep them short. "We have plans after, Mom. Valeria isn't feeling well. It's raining too hard for you to drive at night." There was always a reason. There was always Valeria. Last Mother's Day, Rodrigo didn't call. I waited all day. I checked my phone every half hour like a teenager waiting for a text from someone who doesn't think of her. At 9 in the evening, he sent a text message. One text. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom. We were really busy. I'll call soon." No punctuation, no call, no soon that ever actually came. That night, I put the phone in the drawer, turned off the light, and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling. And for the first time in many years, I didn't cry. I just thought. How much longer? The answer came months later, in the form of a conversation that was never meant for my ears,
but one that changed everything.
To understand what came next, you have to understand what came before. Because Rodrigo wasn't born into a family with money. He was born into a family with love. And for a long time, I believed that was enough. When Manuel died, I had exactly $4,200 in our bank account. $4,200. And a 19-year-old son who wanted to study engineering in the city. The university cost 3 times that in the first semester alone. Any other woman might have said, it can't be done. I said, let me figure out how. The first thing I did was sell Manuel's car. It was an old sedan, dented hood, broken air conditioning, but it was my husband's car, and every time I saw it in the driveway, I felt like he was still home. I sold it on a Saturday morning, signed the papers with a shaking hand. The buyer never looked me in the eyes. With that money, I paid Rodrigo's first semester. The second thing was the overnight shift at the factory, 11 at night to 6 in the morning, 3 days a week. Industrial sewing machines that made a noise that burrowed into your ears and stayed there even when you were home trying to sleep. My coworkers were women like me, tired, quiet, carrying stories they didn't tell because there was no time. We said hello with our eyes. That was enough. The other days, I cleaned houses, 4 regular houses a week, sometimes 5 if someone needed help for a party or a move. I mopped marble floors with the same hands that had once embroidered tablecloths for my own table. I scrubbed bathrooms in homes that had more rooms than people. I ironed shirts of men who earned in 1 day what I earned in a month. And I smiled. I always smiled, because the work didn't embarrass me. What would have embarrassed me was the thought of Rodrigo having to drop out of school. That I could not have survived. Every 2 weeks, I sent him money. At first, he would ask, "Where are you getting this, Mom?" I told him I had savings, that Manuel had left something set aside, that he shouldn't worry. Small lies build from enormous love. With time, he stopped asking, and that hurt more than the exhaustion. There was one winter, Rodrigo was in his 3rd year of college, when the furnace in my house broke down. It was the middle of cold season. The repairman told me the fix would cost what I made in 3 weeks. I had to choose. I sent the money to Rodrigo for his semester books, and I slept in 2 blankets and one of Manuel's old sweaters for 42 days until I could afford the repair. 42 days. I counted them. I don't know why I counted them. Maybe because counting hard things is the only way to keep from losing your mind. Rodrigo never knew about the cold, never knew about the 42 days. When he graduated, it was the happiest day of my life. I wore the blue dress I had been saving for special occasions. I did my hair carefully. I bought flowers. I arrived at the ceremony 2 hours early to get a good seat. When I watched him cross the stage in his cap and gown, diploma in hand, I cried in a way I hadn't cried since Manuel's funeral. But in reverse, those tears weren't heavy. Those tears were light. They were the weight finally leaving. After the ceremony, his friends surrounded him for photos. I waited to the side, patient, as always. When he finally came to me, he hugged me tight. That hug was real. That one reached all the way inside and whispered in my ear, "Thank you, Mom. I know everything you did." I believed he meant it. I believed it meant he would never forget. How wrong I was. Because 3 months after that graduation, he met Valeria, and everything he knew, he forgot slowly. The way you forget something that no longer serves you, the way you pack into a box what no longer fits in your new life. But I forgot nothing. I kept every receipt, every payment, every sacrifice. Not out of resentment. At the time, I kept them out of habit. Later, I understood I had kept them out of instinct, as if some part of me had always known that one day I would need to tell the full story, with proof. There's something I never told anyone. Not the neighbors, not my closest friend Rosario, not Father Mendez, who heard my confession on Sundays. A secret I carried alone for years.
Not out of shame, but because I understood very early that certain information only has value when it's kept in silence. Manuel taught me that without meaning to. My husband was a good man, but he was a man who didn't trust banks. Elena, he used to say, the money you can see is the money that exists. What's on paper can disappear. What's in your hands cannot. I used to laugh. I told him he was old-fashioned, but I listened. 3 years before he died, Manuel bought a piece of land. It wasn't much, an empty lot on the edge of town, dry earth, no construction, no obvious value. He paid cash, he registered it in both our names, and he said something to me that I didn't fully understand at the time. This land isn't for us, Elena. It's for when we're no longer here and someone needs it. I thought he meant to Rodrigo, that it was a gift for our son. I put the documents in a brown folder, inside a shoebox, underneath my winter clothes. And I forgot about them. Or so I thought. 10 years after Manuel's death, when Rodrigo had already gone 2 years without calling regularly, and Valeria had already made herself the invisible owner of everything, I received a letter. A letter from the county. The land Manuel had bought was located in an area the city had just designated as a commercial development zone. What had once been dry, worthless earth was now worth 4 times what Manuel had paid for it. And it was still registered in both our names, Manuel's and mine. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully, tucked it into the same brown folder, and I didn't say a word to anyone. Not to Rodrigo, not to Valeria, not to a single soul. Why didn't I say anything? Because in that moment, something shifted inside me. It wasn't a calculated thought. It wasn't a cold plan. It was instinct. The same instinct that tells you the weather is about to change before a single cloud appears. The same quiet inner voice that women learn to listen to when the world has ignored them for too long. That voice said, "Wait, you don't know everything yet." And it was right. Because if I had said something in that moment, Rodrigo and Valeria would have shown up to my door with smiles they hadn't used in years, with borrowed warmth, with words of affection that smelled like self-interest. And I would have fallen for it, because that's what mothers do. We fall, even when we know the ground isn't solid. But something in me decided not to fall this time, decided to watch instead. I started paying attention in a different way. I was no longer the mother waiting by the phone. I was a woman studying a pattern. And patterns, when you see them clearly, never lie. I noticed that Rodrigo called more when he had money problems, that visits always lined up with moments where they needed something, a signature, a favor, a loan that was never fully paid back. I noticed that Valeria would ask, with that casualness that isn't casual at all, about the properties Manuel left behind, about whose name the house was under, about how the inheritance was set up. Questions wrapped in conversation, hooks disguised as interest. And I noticed something else, something that hurt differently, not like the abandonment, but like the confirmation of something I hadn't wanted to believe. Rodrigo knew what Valeria was doing. He wasn't a man being manipulated without his knowledge. He was a man who chose not to see because not seeing was more comfortable, because Valeria gave him a comfortable life, an elevated social circle, a new identity, and I was the reminder of where he came from. And sometimes people would rather forget where they came from than let go of where they're trying to go. That was what cost me the most to accept. Not Valeria's cruelty, Rodrigo's willingness to look away. But accepting it was also what set me free. Because when you stop waiting for someone to change, you start changing yourself. And I had spent too long being the same woman, the patient one, the quiet one, the one who waits. It was time to be something else. I pulled the brown folder out from under the winter clothes, opened it on the kitchen table, reviewed every document: the land, the deed, the papers from the bank where Manuel had opened a joint savings account in both our names, an account I had never touched because I had never needed to. And when I looked at the numbers, I understood that Manuel hadn't just left me land, he had left me time. Time to decide, time to act, time to choose when, how, and with whom. That night, I slept differently. Not exactly peacefully, with something closer to the calm a tree feels before a storm, when the roots are already deep and the branches are ready to bend without breaking. I was no longer the woman waiting on the porch. I was a woman who knew something the others didn't. And that, quiet and contained, was the most power I'd had in years.
The confirmation came on a Sunday in February. I wasn't looking for it. It simply appeared, the way truths that have been hidden too long always appear, all at once, without warning, in the most ordinary moment. Rodrigo had invited me to lunch, a strange invitation because there hadn't been one in months, but it came. A phone call on a Wednesday night, friendly voice, casual tone. "Mom, come over Sunday. Valeria's going to make something." I should have noticed it then. Rodrigo never said Valeria's going to make something like it was a gift. That phrase had a different flavor. But I went, because I'm his mother, and mothers go even when their instincts tell them to wait. I arrived on time, rang the doorbell. Nobody answered. I waited 2 minutes and rang again. I could hear voices inside. Clearly someone was home, clearly they were there, but nobody moved toward the door. I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. I tried calling Rodrigo. 2 rings, voicemail. That's when I noticed the side gate, the one that opened to the backyard, was slightly ajar. I shouldn't have gone in that way, but I did. The backyard was empty. The back kitchen door was also open, and from there the voices came through clearly. I stopped, not because I wanted to eavesdrop, but because what I heard in the first 3 seconds left me unable to move. It was Valeria's voice, clear, steady, the tone of someone who speaks freely when they believe no one important is listening. All we need is for her to sign. If she does it voluntarily, it's easier, but if not, brief silence. Then Rodrigo's voice, quieter, less sure. "I don't know if she'll want to sign. That's the house she raised me in." Valeria again. "Rodrigo, that house is worth money. Money we could use right now. Your mom is getting older. She lives alone. What does she need all that space for? We convince her it's what's best for her, that she moves somewhere smaller, more manageable." Pause. And if she doesn't want to? Valeria's answer came without hesitation. Then we find another way. There are legal options when there's cognitive decline. I went cold. Not from fear, from absolute clarity. Cognitive decline. Those 2 words, said so casually with that clinical detachment, as if it were a tool and not a lie, told me everything I needed to know about how far they were willing to go. I kept listening. I didn't move. I learned that in the factory, when a machine makes a strange sound, don't shut it down immediately. Listen first. Identify the full problem before you act. If you act too soon, the damage is worse. Valeria kept talking. She talked about the land. That lot Manuel bought must be in her name too. We need to look into that. And right then I knew they had already been researching, that this wasn't a new conversation, that they had been planning for a while.
She talked about the bank account. She probably has something saved. Old ladies from that generation always do, with a contempt so casual it stung more than any shout ever could. And she talked about that Sunday visit. Today we keep it warm. No papers yet. Just let her feel loved. Let her guard down. Rodrigo was quiet for a long moment. I held my breath. And then I heard something that was worse than everything before it. Worse than Valeria's plans. Worse than the words about cognitive decline. Worse than it all. I heard my son sigh and say, "Okay, just make sure it doesn't look like we're in a rush." That was all I needed to hear. I stepped back from the gate without a sound, walked to my car, got in, put my hands on the steering wheel, and sat there completely still for several minutes. Not crying, not shaking, without the pain I would have expected to feel, just still, like water before it boils, that from the outside shows nothing, but on the inside has already reached temperature. I checked my phone. A message from Rodrigo, sent 2 minutes earlier. "Mom, sorry, something came up. Can we reschedule for next week?" I read it twice. Then I typed, "Of course, son, no problem," with a period at the end, with total calm, with the steadiness of a woman who is no longer waiting for anything from anyone, but preparing something for everyone. I started the car, drove home, and on the way, with the sun burning orange across the road, I thought about Manuel, about something he told me once, years ago, when I was upset about a neighbor who had wronged us. "Don't waste your energy reacting, Elena. Save it. The right moment always comes. You just have to be ready when it does." My whole life I had saved my energy. My whole life I had waited for the right moment. The moment had come, and I was ready. That night, I didn't sleep. But it wasn't the insomnia of anguish. It was the insomnia of someone reorganizing everything from the inside. Like when you move the furniture in a room and need to see the empty space before you decide where everything goes. I sat in the rocking chair on the porch with a cup of tea that went cold without me drinking it, and I stayed there watching the garden in the dark. I thought about every version of myself I had ever been. The obedient daughter who never contradicted anyone. The wife who learned to read Manuel's silences better than his words. The mother who worked overnight shifts so her son could sleep soundly. The widow who smiled at other people's funerals so she wouldn't fall apart at her own. The kind neighbor who never complained. Every single one of those versions had something in common. They all waited. They all gave way. They all put others first. And I asked myself, with the kind of honesty that hurts like cold water in January, whether that had been virtue or fear dressed up as generosity. The answer came on its own, without drama, without tears. Both things, Elena. It was always both things. I had given out of love, that was true, but I had also stayed quiet out of fear. Fear that if I set boundaries, they would stop needing me. Fear that if I said, "This hurts me," they would leave. And they left anyway, with my boundaries or without them, with my silence or without it. That's what nobody tells you about sacrifice without a voice, that it doesn't protect anything, that the people who want to leave, leave regardless, and the ones who stay out of obligation were already gone a long time ago. I got up from the rocking chair, went inside, walked straight to the kitchen, the small kitchen that smelled like sweet bread, the same one where I had cried so many times waiting for calls that never came. I opened the drawer where I kept the important things, took out the brown folder, put it on the table, opened it, and this time I didn't look at it through the eyes of Manuel's widow. I looked at it through the eyes of Elena Vargas, A 67-year-old woman with strong hands, a clear head, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Something changed in that moment. It wasn't a change in character. I was still the same calm woman with the soft voice who greeted the neighbors by name. It was a change in center, like a tree that has always grown leaning towards someone else's light, suddenly deciding to grow straight, not to become a different tree, to become completely itself. The Elena who existed until that night lived so that others could be okay. The Elena who was born that night in the kitchen lived so that she could be okay. And from that place, not from bitterness, not from cheap revenge, she was going to make every decision that followed. Coldness is not the same as cruelty. I understood that night. Coldness is clarity without emotional interference. It's seeing things as they are, not as you wish they were. It's acting from reason without letting fear or misguided love pull you off course. Valeria was cold out of ambition. I was going to be cold out of justice. It was not the same thing. It would never be the same thing. I took out a blank piece of paper, and with the same careful handwriting I had written hundreds of birthday cards, Christmas cards, Mother's Day cards that probably ended up in the trash, I wrote a list, not of grievances, not of insults, a list of assets: the house, the land, the bank account, the documents, and next to each, a question. What do I know? What do I need to know? What do I need to do? It was the first time in decades I had thought of myself as an asset, as someone with resources, with power, with options, not as the mother waiting on the porch, but as the woman who decides who comes in and who doesn't. At 3 a.m, I put the list back inside the brown folder, drank the cold tea in one swallow, and went upstairs to bed. Before I closed my eyes, I looked at Manuel's ring on my finger. I said to him in silence, "You told me the money you can see is the money that exists. You were right, but there's also the money they hide, the power they ignore, and the woman they underestimate. They won't be able to underestimate her anymore." I slept 4 hours, deep, no dreams, the way people sleep when they've already made a decision and there's nothing left to debate. The next morning, I got up early. I dressed well, not from anyone, for myself, did my hair with care, made a real breakfast, eggs and fruit and hot coffee, sat at the kitchen table and ate slowly. No rush, no phone, not waiting for anyone to call. When I finished, I washed the plate, dried it, put it in its place, and walked out the door. I had appointments to make, people to see, a plan to build, brick by brick, with the same patience I had used to sew other people's fabric in the middle of the night, with the same precision I had used to count every paycheck so nothing would be missing. Only this time, everything I built was going to be for me.
The first person I went to see was attorney Carmen Fuentes, lawyer, mid-50s, small office on the main avenue with plants in the window and diplomas on the wall that she never mentioned because she didn't need to mention them. I had known her for years. She had handled the insurance paperwork when Manuel died, resolved a property line dispute with a neighbor, small things. But I had never visited her for anything like this. I sat down across from her desk, put the brown folder on the table between us, and told her, without hesitation, without tears, with the voice of a woman who had finished crying, "I need to know exactly what I have, whose name it's in, and what someone could do to take it from me." Carmen looked at me for a moment. Then she opened the folder, and for the next hour, I took notes. The first thing I learned was this: the house was in my name alone. Manuel had put it exclusively in my name before we were even married, a detail I had forgotten, that Rodrigo had never known,
and that Valeria had clearly not researched carefully enough. Nobody could touch it without my signature. Nobody. That was the first thing I exhaled deeply upon hearing. The second was the land. It was registered in both names, Manuel and mine, but since Manuel had passed away without a formal will assigning it to a specific heir, his portion entered into probate. That meant Rodrigo, as the only child, had legal grounds to claim half of his father's share. Carmen was direct. If he initiates probate proceedings, he could claim 25% of the land. Pause. But that takes time, and in the meantime, you can act. Act how? Carmen smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who has seen many cases and knows that patience is the strongest legal argument there is. You can sell your portion of the land before he initiates any claim against the estate. You can donate your share to whoever you choose. You can create a trust. You have many options, Elena, as long as you move before there's an active claim against the estate. I took notes. Then I asked what mattered most to me. Can they use the argument of cognitive decline to take control of my assets? Carmen stopped writing. She looked at me directly. Only with a formal medical diagnosis, 2 witnesses, and a judge's approval. It's a long, difficult, expensive process. And if you are active, documented, and legally represented, it's nearly impossible to succeed. Nearly. That word stayed with me. What do I need to make it impossible without the nearly? Carmen nodded slowly. You need to move first. I left that office with 4 things clearly understood and a plan divided into stages. It wasn't a plan built from hatred. It was a plan built like architecture, like constructing a house, foundation first, then walls, then roof, every stage in order, nothing skipped. Stage 1, protect the house. The first thing was the most important. Although the house was in my name alone, Carmen recommended registering it with a homestead protection clause, a legal shield that made it nearly impossible for anyone to claim it as part of a future debt or inheritance dispute without a lengthy and costly court process. It cost money to do it, money I had, money nobody knew I had. I signed the paperwork that same week. Stage 2, the land. This was where Carmen and I had to think more carefully. I couldn't sell the land all at once without raising suspicion. If Rodrigo found out before everything was in place, he could initiate probate proceedings and complicate things considerably. The solution was more elegant. Carmen reached out to a local developer who had been interested in parcels in that area for months. We negotiated quietly. No announcements, no signs, no listing with Elena Vargas's name attached until the ink was dry. The price they offered was better than expected, much better. Stage 3, the bank account. The joint account Manuel had opened had gone untouched for years. I had never touched it, partly out of habit, partly out of that quiet respect we hold for things that belonged to someone who was no longer here. But it had a balance that, combined with my own savings, was enough to live well, not lavishly, but with dignity, for many years to come. Carmen recommended a financial advisor she trusted, a serious man, few words, who explained my options with patience and without condescension. I reorganized everything. New account, my name only, different bank, with clear instructions about who would receive what if something happened to me. And Rodrigo was not the only name on that list. Stage 4, the witnesses. Carmen explained that the strongest protection against any claim of cognitive decline was documentation, medical, legal, social. I visited my primary doctor, Dr. Herrera, who had known me for 15 years, and asked for a full cognitive evaluation.
Not because I needed it, because I needed the paper. The result was what anyone who knew me would have expected. "Elena, you are in perfect health," he said with a smile. "Frankly, your memory is better than mine." I filed that document in the folder. I also spoke with 2 people from the neighborhood, my neighbor, Mrs. Petra, and Mr. Armando from the hardware store, without giving them details, just asking that if anyone ever questioned my state of mind, they tell the truth, that they saw me every day, that I was sharp, that I was a clear-headed, active, independent woman. Both said yes without hesitating. I kept that, too. Not on paper, in memory. Stage 5. The wait. This was the hardest stage, not because it required effort, because it required silence. Continuing to be Miss Elena to everyone, answering Rodrigo's occasional messages with the same calm tone as always, accepting the rescheduled lunch invitation with the same warmth as always. Sitting in that living room with its perfect furniture and artificial flowers, and smiling while Valeria talked about properties and inheritance with that calculated casualness. Listening without revealing that I knew. Waiting without showing that I had already moved. That lunch was the hardest thing I had done in years, not because of the pain, because I had to contain something completely new. Not tears, not anger. I had to contain satisfaction. Because while Valeria talked about properties and inheritance with that calculated casualness, I had already moved everything. While she smiled, thinking she had control, I had already changed the rules of the game. While Rodrigo looked at me as the old, lonely, manageable mother, I was the only person at that table who knew exactly how this was all going to end. I just needed the moment. And the moment, I was going to choose myself. It came at Easter, the way resurrection always comes, after the longest silence, after the darkest days, without warning, but exactly when it was supposed to.
Rodrigo's call came on a Wednesday before Easter weekend. Friendly voice, calculated tone, that borrowed warmth you learn to recognize once you've heard it too many times. "Mom, we want you to spend Easter with us. Valeria's going to cook. We'll do it at the house." I paused briefly, not out of hesitation, out of form. "That sounds wonderful, son. I'll be there." I hung up, sat quietly for a moment, then called Carmen. The invitation came. Carmen responded without missing a beat. "Perfect. Everything is ready on our end. Are you ready?" I looked out the window at the garden that I had neglected for years and had slowly started cleaning up over the past few weeks. The roses I thought were dead were beginning to bloom. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." But before Easter Sunday, the first consequences had already started arriving, without Rodrigo or Valeria knowing I had anything to do with it. That's how a well-built plan works. The first dominoes fall on their own, and the ones who set them up don't realize what's happening until they can no longer stop it. The first domino, the land. 3 weeks before Easter, the land sale was finalized. No drama, no announcement, a clean transaction between adults, properly recorded, every document in order. The money landed in the new account. My name only, my bank. That same afternoon, I received a text from Rodrigo. Casual, too casual. "Hey, Mom, have you thought about what you're going to do with the land Dad left? A friend of Valeria's says that area is getting really good for selling." I read it, smiled alone in my kitchen, replied, "Oh, sweetheart, that land hasn't given me anything in years. Let me think about it." Period at the end. The land had had a new owner for 72 hours. The second domino, the attorney. Rodrigo had an accountant, a man named Gustavo, who managed his personal finances, and who, based on conversations I'd overheard over the years, also advised him on how to optimize family assets.
an elegant euphemism for helping him think through how to claim what belonged to others within the family. What Rodrigo didn't know was that Gustavo and Carmen knew each other. Not exactly friends, but they moved in the same professional circles. And Carmen, without revealing any names or confidential details, had casually dropped into a professional conversation that certain attempts to claim the assets of elderly adults without solid evidence of incapacity could result in costly and very public countersuits. Gustavo understood. Whatever Gustavo told Rodrigo afterward was no longer my concern. But I suspect the conversation about optimizing family assets cooled considerably after that. The third domino, the account. Valeria had an added card. Not from my account, I had never been that careless, but from an account Rodrigo had opened years ago with a small fund I had transferred him for emergencies. $2,000 that had sat there forgotten, the way favors are forgotten by those who receive too many. One Monday morning, Carmen and I reviewed the details together. That account was technically in Rodrigo's name only. He had never given me formal access, which said everything about how he had been thinking from the very beginning. There was nothing to reclaim there, but there was also nothing to lose. I called my bank, canceled the automatic monthly transfer I had still been making, out of habit, out of inertia, out of that instinct for giving that doesn't shut itself off easily, toward a secondary account Rodrigo had quietly linked to mine, without asking me, $150 a month. It wasn't a fortune. It was a beginning. Rodrigo called 2 days later. "Mom, do you know if there was some kind of problem with the bank? The transfer didn't come through this month." Calm voice, pretending it was an administrative question. "Oh, honey, I've been reviewing my expenses. At my age, you have to be more careful with money. I spoke with the bank to go over everything." Pause on his end. "Oh, right. No worries. Don't stress about it." "Thank you for understanding, son." I hung up, and noticed he hadn't said I didn't need it anyway. He had only said, "No worries." Those two responses are not the same thing. The fourth domino, the house. The homestead protection clause was already registered, but Carmen suggested something more, something that at first seemed excessive to me. Later, I understood it was exactly necessary. "Elena, is there someone you trust, outside of Rodrigo, that you'd want to include as a beneficiary of the house in a formal will?" I thought about it for 3 days, and I remembered Lucia.
Lucia was the daughter of my closest friend, Rosario, 32 years old, elementary school teacher, a serious, hard-working young woman who, as a little girl, spent her afternoons at my house when her mother worked late. I had taught her how to sew. She called me Aunt Elena, even though I wasn't her aunt. And when Rosario died, 4 years ago, from a fast and cruel cancer, Lucia came to find me, not to ask for anything, just to be near someone who also missed her mother. That kind of person doesn't get manufactured. That kind of person gets protected. I called her on a Thursday afternoon, asked her to come over for coffee. When she arrived, I explained, plainly, calmly, what I had decided. Lucia looked at me with wide eyes. "Aunt Elena, I never expected anything from you." "I know," I said. "That's exactly why it's you." I signed the paperwork that week. The house, if something happened to me, had a clear destination, and it was not the one Valeria had planned. All of this happened in silence, in order, without rush and without pause, the way you sew a long piece of fabric, stitch by stitch, skipping nothing, never hurrying because the needle doesn't forgive the mistakes of someone in a rush. And while all of this was happening, Rodrigo and Valeria kept living their normal life, kept planning the Europe trip,
kept talking about Mom's assets in conversations they believed were private, kept smiling with the smile of people who believe time was working in their favor. They didn't know that time had already switched sides. The Saturday before Easter, I got up early, went to the market, bought fresh flowers, not to bring to them, for my garden. I planted 3 new rose bushes next to the ones already blooming, got dirt under my fingernails, and while I planted, I thought about how this was also part of the plan, not the legal plan, the life plan, reminding myself that after all of this, there was life. There was a garden. There were quiet mornings with hands in the soil and sun on my back. There was Elena Vargas, whole, free, in full possession of what was hers. Easter Sunday arrived clear, no clouds, that clean air that only belongs to days when something important is about to happen. I dressed carefully, the blue dress, the same one from the day of Rodrigo's graduation, Manuel's ring on my finger, the brown folder in my bag, not the whole folder, just the documents I needed, selected with precision. Before leaving, I looked at myself in the entryway mirror, a woman of 67 years, hands with scars, white hair she no longer dyed because years ago she had decided that time was not something to hide. Calm eyes, completely calm. It is time, I told myself, and walked out.
I arrived on time. This time the front door was open before I even rang the bell. Rodrigo was waiting in the doorway with a smile he had rehearsed. I know because it was the same smile he used as a little boy when he had broken something and was hoping I wouldn't notice. "Mum, I'm so glad you came. You look beautiful." "Thank you, son." I walked in. The house smelled like real food for the first time I could remember. Valeria had cooked, or at least had made the effort to look like she had cooked. The table was set with a white tablecloth, crystal glasses, flowers in the center, everything calculated to create an atmosphere of warmth that didn't exist in any other visit. Let her feel loved, let her guard down. Her own words. I sat down, accepted the coffee Valeria offered me with a new, unfamiliar friendliness that didn't fit her, like borrowed clothes that don't quite hang right. We talked about nothing important for the first 20 minutes. The weather, Easter weekend, a television show neither of us actually watched. Rodrigo was quieter than usual, nervous, though he hid it well. Valeria carried the weight of the conversation with the energy of someone who has an agenda and wants to reach it without it looking like she has an agenda. I drank my coffee slowly, listened, waited. It was Valeria who opened the door, as always. Elena, she had started using my first name in recent months without being invited to, as if the formal distance were an obstacle to what she needed to ask me. "We've been thinking about the future, about how to be more present for you, about you not being so alone." Loaded pause. "And we thought it might be good to talk about the assets, the house, the land, so everything is clear and organized, so you have peace of mind." She glanced at Rodrigo. Rodrigo looked at me. "It's just to protect you, Mum." The silence that followed lasted exactly 5 seconds. I counted them, because sometimes silence is the most powerful answer there is. Then I set my cup on the saucer carefully. No rush, no trembling in my hands, and I looked at them both. First, Valeria, then Rodrigo, and said with the quietest voice I have ever used in my life, "I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to talk about that too." I opened my bag, took out the documents, set them on the table, on the white tablecloth between the crystal glasses and the centerpiece flowers, everything calculated to create an atmosphere of warmth that didn't exist in any other visit. Let her feel loved, let her guard down. Her own words.
I sat down, accepted the coffee Valeria offered me with a new, unfamiliar friendliness that didn't fit her, like borrowed clothes that don't quite hang right. We talked about nothing important for the first 20 minutes. The weather, Easter weekend, a television show neither of us actually watched. Rodrigo was quieter than usual, nervous though he hid it well. Valeria carried the weight of the conversation with the energy of someone who has an agenda and wants to reach it without it looking like she has an agenda. I drank my coffee slowly, listened, waited.
It was Valeria who opened the door, as always. Elena, she had started using my first name in recent months without being invited to, as if the formal distance were an obstacle to what she needed to ask me. We've been thinking about the future, about how to be more present for you, about you not being so alone. Loaded pause. And we thought it might be good to talk about the assets, the house, the land, so everything is clear and organized, so you have peace of mind. She glanced at Rodrigo. Rodrigo looked at me. It's just to protect you, Mom. The silence that followed lasted exactly 5 seconds. I counted them, because sometimes silence is the most powerful answer there is. Then I set my cup on the saucer carefully. No rush, no trembling in my hands, and I looked at them both, first Valeria, then Rodrigo, and said with the quietest voice I have ever used in my life, I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to talk about that too. I opened my bag, took out the documents, set them on the table, on the white tablecloth between the crystal glasses and the centerpiece flowers, with the same calm you use when you set bread on the table. Rodrigo frowned. Valeria went still. The land, I said, pointing to the first document, was sold 3 weeks ago. The transaction is recorded. The money is already in my account. Silence. The house, I continued, pointing to the second document, has a homestead protection clause registered 1 month ago. No one can claim it, freeze it, or transfer it without my explicit consent. No one. The color of Valeria's face shifted. Not dramatically, just 1 shade paler, just her eyes moving a fraction faster than normal. And this, I said, placing the third document on top of the others, is my will, signed, notarized, with 2 witnesses and municipal registration. Everything in order. Rodrigo opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Mom, when did you do all of this? A while ago, son. Why didn't you tell us? I looked at him, and I said something I had been holding for a long time, not with cruelty, but with the precision of someone who finally says out loud what everyone knows but nobody names. Because I heard the conversation in your kitchen in February, when you thought I was still waiting at the door. The silence that followed was different from the one before. That silence didn't last 5 seconds. That silence spread the way spilled water spreads, slow, unstoppable, covering everything. Valeria was the first to speak, because Valeria was always the first to speak. Elena, I think there was a misunderstanding. That conversation was taken out of context. Valeria. I said her name with a calm that stopped her better than any raised voice ever could. I'm not here to argue about what I heard. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters has already been done. I turned to Rodrigo, my son, the name I chose on a rainy night looking for something that meant strength. I looked at him the way only mothers look at their children, with all the love and all the pain mixed into one moment, impossible to separate one from the other even if you wanted to. Rodrigo, I love you. I will always love you. That doesn't change. Pause. But love is not a blank check, and I took far too long to understand that. Rodrigo's eyes were glassy. I don't know if it was shame or something deeper than shame. Mom, I didn't want to. I know, I interrupted.
You didn't want to, but you did, and there's a very small difference between the two. Valeria tried one more time. Look, if we did something wrong, we can talk about it as a family. Valeria. Her name again, that same calm. You and I are not family. We never were. Not because I didn't want to be, I tried, even if you don't remember, but because you decided from the beginning that I was an obstacle and not a person. That's not... You left the door closed while I was standing outside holding a cake. Silence. You called me old lady in your own kitchen. Deeper silence. And you talked about cognitive decline like it was a tool. Valeria didn't respond. For the first time since I had known her, she didn't respond. I gathered the documents back into my bag, stood up from the chair calmly, picked up my purse, straightened my blue dress, and before leaving, I did something I hadn't planned, something that came from somewhere deep inside on its own. I walked to the kitchen, took the cake I had brought because I had brought one, walnut and caramel, the same as always, because some things don't break even when the world around them does, and placed it in the center of the table, next to where the documents had been, next to the artificial flowers, next to the crystal glasses that had never held real warmth between us. "The cake is for you," I said from the doorway. "Happy Easter." I walked out, closed the door, not with a slam, with care, the way you close something that has finally ended. I drove 2 blocks, pulled over, not to cry, just to breathe, to feel the weight leaving, to listen to the new silence that remained when you finally put down what was never yours to carry. I called Lucia. "How did it go, Aunt Elena?" "Well," I said, and it was true. "Are you free for lunch today?" "I already have the rice going." I laughed, the first clean laugh in a very long time. I started the car and drove toward where someone was waiting for me, toward where I always should have been going. A lot of people would have expected me to destroy them, to use everything I knew to humiliate them publicly, to call their friends, their acquaintances, the neighbors in their expensive gated community and tell them exactly who lived behind those crystal glasses and European vacation plans. To take everything, to leave them with nothing. That would have been easy revenge. And easy revenge feels good for exactly 5 minutes. After that, it only leaves more weight. I had carried enough weight in my life. I wasn't going to add more. What I did was different. What I did was let reality be the punishment. Because reality, when you let it work on its own, is more brutal and more fair than anything you could ever design yourself. What happened to Rodrigo? Without the land, without the house as an available asset, without the monthly transfers I had canceled, Rodrigo had to face something he had been avoiding for years: his own finances. Valeria had expensive tastes and zero tolerance for adjustments. The apartment where they lived carried a high rent. The social circle they had built required dinners, trips, clothes, appearances. All of it cost money. And Rodrigo earned well. He was an engineer. He had steady work. But he had lived for years with the silent safety net I represented. Not because I constantly gave him money, but because he knew that if something went wrong, Mom's house was there. Dad's land was there. Something was always there. When that something disappeared, the balance shifted. I didn't find out the details from him. I found out through Lucia, who moved in different circles, who heard conversations I would never have been part of. Rodrigo and Valeria canceled the Europe trip. Work got complicated, they told their friends. Then they canceled the apartment renovation they had been planning. It wasn't the right time, they said. Then there were tense conversations. Lucia didn't hear them directly, but tension shows. It always shows in the way couples look at each other in public when they think nobody is watching. Valeria needed a man with resources. Rodrigo, without his mother's safety net, was simply an engineer with a fixed salary and moderate debt. That was not what Valeria had calculated, and Valeria was very good at calculating. I didn't feel joy about that, or at least not in the way you might expect. I felt something closer to the quiet sadness of someone who turns out to be right about something they would have preferred to be wrong about. Because a part of me, the part that is still his mother, regardless of everything else, would have wanted Rodrigo to have found something real in Valeria, for the price of walking away from me to have been worth something genuine, for him not to have traded a mother for an ambition. But that's how it was. And that was his consequence, not mine.
What happened to Valeria? Valeria was intelligent. I'll acknowledge that without difficulty. But her intelligence had one fundamental flaw. It only worked when she controlled the information. When I moved everything in silence without her knowing, her intelligence had nothing left to control. And a person who is used to controlling things, when she loses control, doesn't know what to do with her hands. What happened to Valeria wasn't dramatic. There was no public scene, no humiliation in front of her elegant friends. It was simply this. She discovered that the plan she had built so carefully over years, the plan to secure her future through the assets of a manageable old woman, didn't exist. It had never existed the way she believed it had, because the manageable old woman had been watching the whole time, had been saving documents, had been talking to attorneys, had been moving pieces with a patience that Valeria, accustomed to fast results, to visible strategies, never learned to read. That was Valeria's punishment, discovering that she had underestimated someone. And for a woman who had built her entire identity on never underestimating anyone useful and dismissing everyone else, that discovery was exactly proportional to the damage she had caused. What happened to me? This is what nobody tells you in revenge stories. What happens to the protagonist afterward? What occurs when the dust settles and there's no longer a battle to fight? I'm going to tell you the truth. The first days after Easter were strange. Not difficult. Strange. Like when a noise you've been hearing so long you stopped noticing it finally goes silent, and the quiet feels odd, almost uncomfortable, until you adjust and realize that's how it always should have been. Rodrigo didn't call for 2 weeks. When he finally called, a Tuesday afternoon, quiet voice, without the calculated tone of before, he simply said, "Mom, are you okay?" "Yes, son, I'm okay." Long pause. "Can we talk sometime?" I thought about it. Not long. "Yes, when you are ready to talk for real." What does that mean? It means when you come, don't bring prepared excuses or rehearsed explanations. Just bring yourself. Silence. Okay. We didn't set a date that day. It didn't matter. I had learned not to organize my life around when others were ready. If he came, good. If he didn't come, I still had my garden, still had my coffee, still had Lucia on Sundays, still had my mornings to myself, complete, without guilt, without waiting. The real punishment. I want you to understand something. The real punishment for Rodrigo wasn't losing the land, wasn't losing the inheritance that was never his to begin with, wasn't the canceled trip or the tightened budget. The real punishment was simpler and deeper than all of that. The real punishment was the moment he realized, alone, quietly, on some ordinary night, that he had a mother who truly loved him, who worked overnight shifts so he could sleep soundly.
who sold his father's car to pay for his first semester, who slept in the cold for 42 days so he wouldn't go without books, and that he had treated her like an asset, like a resource, like something expendable. That kind of realization doesn't heal quickly. That kind of realization lives in the pillow. It lives in birthdays, in Easters, in every Mother's Day that passes. It lives in the moment you have a child of your own and finally understand, too late, always too late, what the love you received actually meant and how completely you failed to see it. That wasn't a punishment I had given him. It was a punishment he had built for himself, brick by brick, with every call he didn't make, with every short embrace, with every time he chose comfortable silence over uncomfortable truth. I had simply stepped aside so he could see it whole. And that, only that, gave me something I hadn't expected to feel at the end of all this. Not satisfaction, not triumph, something closer to peace. The peace of someone who did the right thing, even when it hurt. The peace of someone who set boundaries, not from bitterness, but from self-respect. The peace of someone who finally treated herself the same care she had always given to everyone else.
There's something I hadn't told you, something I saved for the end. Not because it's the most dramatic detail in the story, but because it's the detail that changes how you see everything that came before. Like when you find something in the background of an old photograph that was always there, and suddenly the whole image means something different. 3 months after Easter, Lucia helped me clean out Manuel's room. That room had been closed since his death, not out of superstition, not out of paralyzing grief, simple because there are things people postpone without clear reason, and that room was one of them. We pulled out clothes, boxes, old tools, books Manuel had never finished but kept with the intention of someday. And at the back of the closet, behind a toolbox and underneath a folded sweater that still carried a faint trace of him, I found an envelope. Brown, thick, with my name written by hand, Manuel's handwriting. I sat on the edge of the bed. Lucia slipped out without being asked, because some moments recognize themselves. I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 things: a letter, a notarized document, and a small silver key with a paper tag that read, First National Bank, Box 447. I read the letter first. Manuel's handwriting, tight, slanted to the right, with that way he had of writing like the words were in a hurry. It said, Elena, if you're reading this, it's because I'm already gone, and because you are the woman I always knew you were, the one who doesn't give up, the one who waits for the right moment, the one who finds things when she needs them. At the bank, there's a box. The number is on the key. Inside, there are documents and something else. I won't explain it here because no more explanation is needed. You'll know what to do with it. What I do need to tell you is this. Never mistake my silence for ignorance. I saw everything you built. I saw everything you carried. I saw everything you gave without anyone asking, and without anyone thanking you the way you deserved. And I also saw what you didn't say, what you kept quiet so others could be okay. Elena, that wasn't weakness. It was the hardest form of love that exists. But the moment has come, and you'll know it when it arrives, to love yourself with that same strength. The house is yours. The land is yours. What's in the box is yours. It was always yours. I was just keeping it until you needed it. With everything I was capable of loving, Manuel. I didn't cry right away. I read the letter twice, then a 3rd time. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. And then I cried, but not the way I had cried other times.
That crying from humiliation, from exhaustion, from endless waiting. I cried the way you cry when something that has been broken for a long time finally finishes healing. The next morning, I went to the bank. I found box 447 without difficulty. Opened it. Inside were investment documents. Manuel, the man who didn't trust banks, the man who said the money you can see is the money that exists, had spent years quietly setting aside small amounts in long-term investment accounts, modest sums at the beginning, that with time, with interest, with the patience that transforms everything when you give it enough room, had become something I wasn't expecting, something that completely changed my situation. It wasn't movie money. It was enough, more than enough, to live well, to travel if I wanted, to help Lucia with her school, to never depend on anyone again, to be, in every possible sense, completely free. There was also an additional note, shorter, written on a folded napkin. Manuel and his napkins, always his most important ideas on napkins, that said simply, "For when Rodrigo forgets who brought him into this world, just in case." I sat in the small private room at the bank for a long, quiet moment, with the key in my hand, the documents on the table, the folded napkin between my fingers. Manuel had known. Not everything. He couldn't have known about Valeria, about the plans, about the conversations in the kitchen, but he had known something fundamental. He had known that the world doesn't always reward the ones who give. He had known that his son was a good man, but a fragile one, someone who could lose his way if he found the wrong influence. He had known that I was going to need, at some point, at some stage of life, not just love, but resources. Not just moral dignity, but real independence. And he had prepared for it, in silence, with the same patience I had used to sew other people's fabric in the middle of the night, with the same precision I had used to count every paycheck so nothing would be missing. Manuel and I were more alike than I remembered. We both stayed quiet about the things that mattered most. We both acted from love without announcing it. We both understood that the things that truly protect you aren't displayed, they're kept until they're needed. There was one more thing in the box. A photograph, small, with white borders starting to fade even though it was in color. Rodrigo as a baby, 6 months old at most, being held by Manuel, who was looking at him with that expression fathers have when they hold their children for the first time and understand that nothing will ever be the same again. And me beside them, young, with long hair, with a smile I didn't remember having but recognized immediately as mine. The three of us, complete, before life started dealing its difficult cards. I put the photograph in my bag, put the documents away, closed the box, handed the key to the bank teller, and told her I wouldn't be needing it anymore. Walked out into the sunlight. And there, standing on the sidewalk with the ordinary noise of the city all around me, I understood something that took me 67 years to understand completely. Manuel hadn't left me money. He had left me time. The land was time to decide. The account was time to act. The box was time to be free. His entire life, working in silence, saving in silence, planning in silence, he had been buying me time, the most scarce thing that exists, the only thing you cannot recover once it's gone. And I, without knowing it, without planning it, had done the exact same thing for Rodrigo. I had bought him time. Time to study, to grow, to make mistakes, to someday, hopefully, understand. The difference was that Manuel knew me well enough to trust that I would use that time well, and I still didn't know if Rodrigo would do the same. But that was no longer my burden to carry. That was his. I called Lucia from the sidewalk. "Did you finish going through the room?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I finished."
Find anything interesting? I looked at the photograph I was holding in my hand. The three of us, complete, before everything. I found exactly what I needed.
The garden took 3 months to come back. 3 months of early mornings with hands in the soil, of consistent watering, of patience without guarantees. There were plants that didn't survive. I pulled them out without drama, without excessive mourning, because sometimes the things that couldn't withstand the neglect simply weren't meant to stay, and forcing them to grow in soil that no longer supported them wouldn't have been gardening. It would have been denial. But the old rose bushes, the ones I thought were dead, the ones that had survived years of neglect because nobody pulled them out, but nobody tended to them either, those bloomed. First slowly, then with a force that surprised me every morning like it was the first time. Deep red, almost wine-colored, the color that belongs to things that survived something hard and know it. Lucia came on Sundays. She brought bread, I made coffee, we sat on the porch, her in the wooden chair, me in the rocking chair, and talked about important things and unimportant things with equal comfort. I taught her how to make the walnut and caramel cake, not because I needed someone to carry the recipe forward, but because some recipes are also stories, and stories deserve to outlive the people who started them. Lucia learned quickly. Her hands had the same patience as her mother's. That made me happy in a way I hadn't expected. I traveled. For the first time in my adult life, I traveled alone and by choice. Not far, at first, a small town 4 hours away, a beach I had always wanted to see, a city with an exhibition of antique textiles that had interested me for years. Small trips, large freedoms. At the textile exhibition, I stood for a long time in front of one particular piece, a hand-embroidered fabric, centuries old, with colored threads that time had worn but not completely erased. The placard explained that this specific technique, a regional style of embroidery, was always worked from the inside out. You started from the center, from the most intimate, most personal point, and you built outward from there. If you started from the edge working inward, the piece never came together properly. The threads pulled wrong. The design lost coherence. It had to start from the center. Always from the center. I stood thinking about that for a long time. My whole life I had embroidered from the edge, from others inward, from Rodrigo, from Manuel, from employers, from neighbors, from anyone who needed something, and me always at the center shrinking, always making myself smaller so others could fit more comfortably. And the piece had never come together quite right, because it couldn't come together right, because that wasn't the correct method. Now I was embroidering from the center, from Elena, and the piece, slow, imperfect, still unfinished, for the first time looked like something coherent, like something that made sense. Rodrigo called in October. No advance notice, an ordinary Thursday afternoon. "Mom, can I come see you Saturday?" Without mentioning Valeria, without an implied agenda, without the calculated voice of before. Just that. "Can I come see you Saturday?" There was a brief silence on my end, not hesitation, measurement, because I had learned that not every door that opens deserves to be thrown wide open. Some open slowly, with care, with conditions that aren't spoken aloud but are held firmly on the inside. "Yes," I said, "come."
He arrived on time, alone, with a small plant in his hand, a little succulent in a clay pot, that he held with the clumsiness of someone not used to carrying delicate things, but who wanted to try anyway. "I didn't know what to bring," he said from the doorway. "I didn't want to show up empty-handed." I looked at him, my son, with his eyes that were Manuel's and his jawline that was mine, and that expression of a grown man who doesn't know exactly how to ask for forgiveness, but showed up anyway. That counted.
showing up anyway always counts. "Come in," I said. "The coffee's ready." It wasn't an easy conversation. It wasn't a movie reconciliation. No background music, no embraces that fix everything, no perfect words that close all wounds at once. It was a conversation between adults. Rodrigo talked. I listened. I talked. He listened. There were uncomfortable moments where we both stared at our coffee instead of each other. There was a moment where I said things that stung, and he didn't argue back, just nodded slowly, head down, with that minimum dignity of someone who accepts what is true even when it costs them. That was the most important part of the whole afternoon, that he didn't defend himself, that he listened. Before he left, we walked out to the garden. I showed him the rose bushes. He stood looking at them for a moment. "I didn't know you had a green thumb, Mom." "Neither did I said. "Turns out they just needed someone to pay attention to them." He looked at me. He understood I wasn't only talking about the roses. I didn't tell him about Manuel's money that day. Not about the documents, not about Box 447, not about the brown envelope. That wasn't for him yet. Maybe someday it would be. Maybe when he showed, not with words, but with time, with presence, with the small things that are actually the largest things, that he could receive that story with the right weight. For now, that was my secret, the last one I kept, and I kept it well. He left at dusk. At the door he stopped, and he hugged me. Not the short embrace of before, not the obligatory hug of someone fulfilling a requirement. He hugged me the way he did when he was small and had a hard day, with his whole body, head tilted into my shoulder, with the weight children carry when they finally release what they'd been holding alone. I didn't say anything. I just held him, because that's something else mothers know how to do. Hold without asking questions, without keeping score, without conditions. Though now, and this was the difference, I knew I could let go too, that holding didn't mean carrying forever, that real love has strong arms and hands that know how to open. That night, after he left, I sat in the rocking chair on the porch. The garden smelled like damp earth and roses. The sky was clear, one of those October skies with more stars than you remember exist until you actually look up at them. I had my coffee in my hand. This time I drank it, hot, slowly, all the way to the end. I thought about Manuel, about the letter, about the napkin, about the photograph of the three of us. "It was always yours," he had written. He was right. It had always been mine. The land, the house, the money, but also, and this was what took me longest to fully understand, the time, the story, the complete version of myself. All of it had always been mine. I had simply been so busy giving it away to others that I had forgotten to claim it. I looked at Manuel's ring on my finger, the same one as always. I turned it slowly, that gesture I made without thinking for years, like a reflex, like a small prayer, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of what it represented. I only felt the cool, smooth metal. I only felt that I had been loved well by someone, and that I had loved myself well in the end, even if it took longer than it should have. Things that matter take time. Roses take time. Trees take time. Justice takes time. And women who learn to go quiet too young take time to find their voice. But when they find it, they speak with a clarity that no amount of screaming could ever match. I got up from the rocking chair, went inside, washed my coffee cup, dried it, put it back in its place, and before turning off the light in the kitchen, the small kitchen that smelled of sweet bread, the kitchen where I cried, where I planned, where I rebuilt myself, I looked at the room for a moment. The cream-colored walls I had repainted in September,
The table where I had laid out the documents, where I had written the list, where I had made the most important decisions of my adult life. And in the center of the table, in the small clay pot Rodrigo brought that afternoon, the little succulent, green, firm, with that quiet stubbornness of plants that don't need much to survive, just solid ground, just a little light, just someone who remembers to water them. I turned off the light, went upstairs, fell asleep quickly, no noise in my head, no pending weights, no names that owed me anything, just Elena, whole, in her house, with her garden blooming outside in the darkness, unseen by anyone, needing no one to see it, simply blooming, because it was its nature, because it was its time, because nothing and no one could stop it anymore.
What this family went through isn't all that different from what so many people deal with in silence, behind closed doors, not knowing how to get out. There's an ebook in the description that might be the first step towards something different.